You think you're not being tracked. Not anymore.
Not after you turned off your phone, deleted your apps, disabled location services, and stepped away from everything that once connected you to the digital world. It feels like control, like you've taken something back, like you've removed yourself from a system that depends on your data to function. And for a moment, that belief feels real. Because everything you've been told about surveillance suggests one simple rule. No device, no tracking, no signal, no visibility, no connection, no risk. But that rule belongs to a world that no longer exists. The systems that once relied on direct signals have evolved into something far more complex. They no longer need your participation. They don't depend on your actions. And they certainly don't stop working just because you decide to step away. Because the truth is, you were never the center of the system. You were never the only source of information. You were just one variable in a much larger equation, an equation built not around what you choose to share, but around everything that happens around you. Every movement, every interaction, every environment you pass through. Even in silence, even without a device, even without intention, data continues to exist. Not because you create it, but because the world does. And the world is constantly being observed. Cities are filled with sensors that don't sleep, cameras that don't forget, systems that don't lose focus. They capture fragments, incomplete, disconnected, seemingly meaningless fragments. A person crossing a street. A figure appearing at the same corner at the same time. A pattern of movement repeating across days, weeks, months. Individually, none of this matters, but together, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes structure. And structure can be analyzed. Once analyzed, it becomes behavior. And behavior, over time, becomes prediction. That's the moment everything changes. Because once a system can predict where you will be, it no longer needs to track you in real time. It no longer needs access to your phone, your messages, or your private data. It only needs to understand you well enough to know what comes next. And once it does, you're no longer hiding. You're simply moving along a path that has already been mapped. A path that leads exactly where the system expects you to go. And when that happens, the question is no longer whether you can be found. The question becomes something far more unsettling. How long have you already been visible, without ever realizing it? For a long time, control felt simple. If you didn't want to be seen, you avoided exposure. If you didn't want to be tracked, you disconnected. The logic was clear, almost comforting. Turn off the phone, disable the signal, stay out of the system. And in doing so, you believed you could step outside of visibility. That belief still exists. It's repeated in forums, shared in advice, passed around as if it were a proven method of disappearing in a connected world. People talk about privacy as a set of actions, something you can actively manage, something you can reduce or eliminate if you're careful enough. But that idea is built on an outdated assumption. It assumes that surveillance is something directed at you, that it begins with your activity and ends when you stop providing input. That if you become passive, the system becomes blind. What it fails to recognize is that modern systems don't begin with you. They begin with the environment. The street you walk down is already mapped. The buildings around you are already monitored. The infrastructure beneath your movement is already collecting information. You don't activate the system, you enter it. And once you do, everything around you starts contributing to a picture you don't control. The cameras that observe traffic are not watching you, but they capture you. The devices carried by other people are not connected to you, but they move with you. The signals that pass through a city are not yours, but they surround you. Individually, each of these elements appears irrelevant. But modern analysis doesn't rely on isolated data. It relies on correlation. If a person appears repeatedly in the same places, at the same times, alongside the same patterns of movement, a structure begins to form. Not because that person revealed themselves, but because consistency revealed them. And consistency is almost impossible to eliminate. You can change your route, you can vary your schedule, you can attempt to behave unpredictably, but over time, patterns return. Because human behavior is not random. It is shaped by habit, necessity, and environment. You go where you need to go. You move when you need to move. You repeat what works. And every repetition leaves an imprint. Not a visible one, but a measurable one. The system doesn't need certainty. It doesn't need your name, your identity, or your intent. It only needs enough consistency to reduce uncertainty. And once uncertainty drops below a certain threshold, you stop being unknown. You become probable. And probability is all the system needs to begin understanding you. This is where the illusion breaks. Because control was never about disappearing completely. It was about believing that you could. And the moment that belief fades, something else becomes clear. You were never outside the system. You were always moving within it. The only difference is that now it understands how you move. At first glance, modern surveillance looks familiar. Cameras mounted on buildings, sensors embedded in infrastructure, systems designed to monitor movement. It appears to be the same model: observe, record, store. But that's no longer what's happening, because the system doesn't just watch anymore. It builds. It takes fragments of reality and turns them into structure. A single camera doesn't know who you are. A single data point doesn't mean anything. But systems today don't rely on single points. They rely on accumulation. A person crossing an intersection at 8:12 a.m. A similar figure appearing 2 blocks away minutes later. A movement pattern that repeats across multiple days. Individually, these are just moments. Disconnected, incomplete, harmless. But when combined, they begin to form continuity. And continuity is where identity starts to emerge. Not your name, not your face, but something more consistent than both. Your behavior. Every person moves differently, not just in where they go, but how they move. The pace, the hesitation, the direction changes. Even without clear identification, these patterns remain stable. And stability is what systems are built to detect. This is where surveillance becomes something else entirely, because it is no longer about recognizing a person. It is about recognizing a pattern that belongs to a person. A pattern that doesn't disappear when you hide your face. A pattern that doesn't vanish when you turn off your phone. A pattern that exists independently of identity. And once that pattern is mapped, the system doesn't need to find you again. It only needs to match movement to expectation. If the pattern appears, the system assumes the person is there. And in most cases, it's right. This is how uncertainty disappears. Not through confirmation, but through repetition. The more consistent the pattern becomes, the less the system needs proof. Eventually, it stops asking questions. It stops verifying and starts predicting. At that point, something fundamental changes. You are no longer being observed as an individual. You are being processed as a model. A model built from fragments, refined through repetition, strengthened over time. And once that model is stable, it becomes more reliable than direct observation, because observation can fail, but a well-built model can anticipate. For years, the public believed surveillance had limits, that it was selective, targeted, focused only on individuals who had already been identified. The idea felt controlled, predictable. If you weren't important, you weren't being watched. That assumption collapsed in 2013, when Edward Snowden exposed something that fundamentally changed how surveillance was understood. The system wasn't built to follow specific people. It was built to collect everything. Phone metadata, location signals, connection logs, not the content of conversations, but the structure around them. Who contacted whom, when it happened, how often it repeated. At first, that didn't seem dangerous, because metadata feels abstract, less invasive, less personal. But that assumption didn't last. Because when you step back, metadata is behavior, and behavior is identity. You don't need to hear what someone says if you can see who they speak to every day. You don't need to read messages if you understand movement patterns. And you don't need to target someone directly if you can analyze the network around them. That was the real shift. Surveillance stopped being about individuals. It became about systems. Entire populations were turned into data sets. Not because every person mattered, but because patterns only emerge at scale. The more data collected, the clearer the structure becomes. And once that structure exists, it can be searched, filtered, refined, until a single pattern stands out. Not because it was being tracked from the start, but because it became visible over time. This is what made the revelation so unsettling. It wasn't just that surveillance existed. It was that it didn't need a reason to begin. It was always running, always collecting, always building, long before a target was ever identified. Which means by the time someone becomes important, the system already knows where to look, already knows who surrounds them, already understands how they move. And by that point, the search is already over. For a long time, surveillance was reactive. Something happened, and the system responded. A signal appeared, and it was traced. A person became important, and they were followed. Everything depended on the present moment. What could be seen? What could be confirmed? What could be verified? But that model no longer defines how modern systems operate. Because at a certain point, watching is no longer enough. If behavior can be measured, it can be modeled. If it can be modeled, it can be predicted. And prediction changes everything. Because prediction removes urgency. It removes the need to constantly observe. It removes the need to chase. Instead of asking where someone is, the system asks where they will be. This shift is powered by something far more advanced than traditional analysis. Machine learning systems trained on massive datasets. Algorithms that don't just recognize patterns, but learn from them. They detect correlations invisible to human perception. Subtle timing differences, route preferences, behavioral consistency across days, weeks, even months. At first, the predictions are rough, probabilities, possibilities. But with enough data, something changes. The system becomes confident, not certain, but close enough that certainty no longer matters. Because in real-world operations, probability is often enough. If there is a high chance that someone will appear in a specific place, you don't need to follow them. You wait. And this is where surveillance becomes something far more unsettling. Because the moment prediction becomes reliable, tracking becomes unnecessary. The system doesn't need to see you. It doesn't need to confirm your location in real time. It only needs to know your pattern and trust that you will follow it. And most of the time, you do. Not because you are careless, but because human behavior is inherently structured. You return to familiar places, You repeat efficient routes. You act within constraints you don't even notice. And those constraints shape your movement in ways that can be learned, modeled, anticipated. So, when the system reaches this stage, something fundamental changes. You are no longer being tracked. You are being expected. And expectation is far more powerful than observation. Because observation depends on presence, but expectation only depends on time. Osama bin Laden understood surveillance better than most. He knew what signals could reveal. Phones could be intercepted. Digital communication could be traced. Electronic footprints could lead directly to a target. So he removed himself from the system. No phone, no internet, no digital presence. On the surface, it worked. For years, there was no direct signal, no confirmed location, no clear way to find him. It seemed like the perfect disappearance. But the system didn't need him to make a mistake. It adapted. Instead of tracking him, they tracked the people around him. Couriers, individuals who moved between locations, who carried messages, who followed routines, even if they tried not to. At first, nothing stood out. Just movements, just patterns, just fragments of behavior. But over time, those fragments began to align. The same routes appeared again. The same locations repeated. The same individuals connected different points. Individually, each piece was meaningless. Together, they formed structure. And once that structure existed, the system no longer needed direct access. It didn't need his voice. It didn't need his device. It didn't need confirmation. It only needed consistency. A compound that didn't match its surroundings. Walls that were higher than necessary. No visible communication lines. And yet, movement continued around it. Controlled, repeated, predictable. That was enough. Because by that point, the question had already changed. It was no longer, where is he? It became, if this pattern continues, what is at the center of it? And once that question was answered, everything else followed. The operation itself was fast, precise, but the outcome had been decided long before that moment. Not when they arrived, not when they entered, but when the pattern became clear enough that there was no longer any uncertainty left. He wasn't found because he was visible. He was found because everything around him was. And once that visibility formed a complete picture, there was nowhere left to hide. What makes all of this truly unsettling is not how advanced the system has become, it's how quietly it operates. There is no visible moment when it starts, no clear signal that you've entered it, no notification that something is watching, because nothing begins. It's already running. Long before you think about privacy, long before you try to disappear, long before you believe you've taken control. The system doesn't need to activate. It simply continues. And while it continues, it learns. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but gradually, silently. It observes repetition. It refines patterns. It reduces uncertainty, until eventually, something changes. Not in the system, but in you. Because at some point, without realizing it, your behavior becomes predictable enough that you no longer need to be observed directly. And that is the moment people misunderstand the most. They imagine surveillance as something active, something that follows, something that watches in real time. But the most effective systems don't behave that way. They don't chase. They don't react. They don't rush. They wait. Because waiting is more efficient than searching, when the outcome is already known. And once your behavior has been modeled, once your patterns have been learned, Once your movement has been reduced to probability, you are no longer being tracked. You are being anticipated. The system doesn't need to know where you are at every moment. It only needs to know where you will be when it matters. And that's what changes everything. Because it means that control was never about hiding. It was about unpredictability. And true unpredictability is almost impossible to maintain. You return to what is familiar. You repeat what works. You move within constraints you don't even notice. And those constraints shape you in ways that can be measured, analyzed, predicted. So the question is no longer whether you can disappear. The question is whether you were ever invisible to begin with. Because in a system that learns continuously, that connects fragments over time, that builds models instead of chasing signals, disappearance is not an action, it's an illusion. And the moment that illusion breaks, something far more unsettling becomes clear. You were never being followed. You were being understood. And once you are understood, you don't need to be found. You simply arrive exactly where the system expects you to be.